Story 8. The Patient Cultivation of Woad. Making Blue Dye in Medieval Europe. Section 1. The Woad Field and the Harvest. Cultivating the blue earth. Imagine, if you will, not the grandeur of cathedrals or the clash of medieval knights, but a far quieter, yet equally vital, tableau. The rolling fields of medieval Europe, stretching under the vast, often cloud-dappled sky. These are not fields of golden wheat or rustling barley, but acres upon acres of a humble, unassuming plant, its leaves a muted, grayish-green, its presence marked by an increasingly distinctive, earthy, almost pungent aroma that subtly permeates the very air. This, dear listener, is the world of woad, a plant that held the unassuming, yet immensely significant, secret to one of humanity's most sought-after colors, a deep, vibrant, enduring blue. Our focus here is not on the dazzling tapestries or the stained glass windows that would eventually display this majestic hue, but rather on the patient, often backbreaking, and fundamentally agricultural labor that brought this color forth from the very soil. It is a story of patient cultivation, of hands deep in the earth, and of a profoundly mundane mechanics that quietly shaped the visual landscape of an entire era. Before the advent of indigo from distant lands, woad was the undisputed monarch of blue in Europe. Its story stretches back into antiquity, with evidence of its use dating to Neolithic times, and its blue pigments adorning the bodies of ancient Celtic warriors. By the medieval period, woad cultivation was a thriving, often highly specialized industry, particularly in regions like Saxony, Thuringia, Picardy, and parts of England. Whole towns, known as woad towns or pastel towns, from the French pastel for woad, grew rich and powerful on the trade of this precious commodity. The woad barons were figures of considerable wealth and influence, their fortunes rooted in these unassuming green leaves. This economic significance, however, was built upon the relentless rhythmic heartbeat of agricultural toil, a cycle of planting, nurturing, and harvesting that dictated the lives of countless laborers. The sensory experience of these fields was unique. The subtle shimmer of the leaves in the sun, the consistent whisper of the wind through the low-lying crops, and that singular, earthy, almost fecal scent that would intensify with each bruised leaf, the very precursor of the magnificent blue that lay dormant within. Let us delve into the very being of this remarkable plant. Isautus tinctoria, the woad plant itself. It is a biennial, meaning its life cycle spans 2 years. In its first year, it forms a low-lying rosette of leaves, broad and succulent, growing close to the ground. These leaves are its treasure, possessing a distinctive grayish-green hue, often with a slightly powdery or waxy coating that helps them retain moisture. They are thick and somewhat fleshy, designed to store the chemical precursors to blue dye. These are the leaves that will be repeatedly harvested. In its second year, if left undisturbed, the plant will send up a tall, slender flowering stalk, which can reach up to 3 or 4 feet in height. This stalk branches out, culminating in clusters of tiny, brilliant yellow flowers. These flowers, though beautiful, signal the end of the plant's useful life for dye production, as the leaves from the second-year plant contain significantly less pigment. Finally, small, dark, tear-shaped seeds will form, encased in papery pods, completing the cycle and ensuring the continuation of the species. The roots of the woad plant are surprisingly deep, anchoring it firmly in the soil, allowing it to draw nutrients and resist drought. For woad to thrive and yield its best, it demanded very specific growing conditions. It preferred heavy, rich clay loams, soils that were well drained yet possessed excellent moisture retention capabilities. These were typically fertile agricultural lands, often in river valleys or well-irrigated plains. The plant, surprisingly, could deplete soil nutrients quickly, requiring meticulous crop rotation and sometimes periods of fallow to allow the earth to recover. A temperate climate was essential, with sufficient warmth during the growing season. For robust leaf development, but without extreme heat that could scorch the leaves or inhibit pigment formation. Consistent, moderate rainfall was ideal, though woad could tolerate some periods of dryness thanks to its deep root system. Farmers would meticulously select plots of land that possessed these ideal characteristics, understanding that the quality of the soil directly translated into the richness of the dye. The subtle aroma of the soil itself, a damp, earthy smell, was a constant presence in these fields. The cultivation practices for woad were a testament to centuries of accumulated agricultural wisdom and tireless manual labor. It all began with soil preparation. In the late winter or early spring, after the last frosts had receded, the fields would come alive with the sound of plows. Whether drawn by oxen, horses, or, in smaller plots, by human muscle, the plows would slowly, methodically turn the heavy soil, breaking up the compacted earth. The deep, rich smell of freshly turned earth, damp and fertile, would rise into the crisp morning air. This was followed by harrowing, where a large, toothed frame, pulled across the plowed furrows, would further break down the clods of earth, creating a finer tilth. The goal was to achieve a finely prepared seedbed, a loose, aerated, and even surface free of large clumps into which the tiny woad seeds could be evenly sown and readily germinate. This initial phase was immensely physical, demanding strength and endurance from both man and beast, laying the groundwork for the season's yield. The rhythmic creak of wooden plows and the soft thud of breaking earth were the overture to the woad season. Once the seedbed was ready, the sowing would commence. This typically occurred in spring, often in March or April, after the danger of severe frost had passed. In some regions with mild winters, a second smaller sowing might occur. In late autumn, the tiny, dark teardrop-shaped woad seeds, about the size of a flax seed, were usually sown by broadcasting by hand. The sower, often with a large pouch or basket of seeds slung over their shoulder, would walk methodically across the prepared field, rhythmically scattering handfuls of the seeds, aiming for an even density of planting. This required a practiced, almost artistic, flick of the wrist to ensure uniform distribution. The sound of the dry seeds scattering over the finely tilled earth was a faint whisper, a delicate counterpoint to the larger sounds of agriculture. There was a quiet hope in this act of sowing, a silent prayer that the tiny seeds, entrusted to the soil, would soon sprout into the valuable plants that would sustain livelihoods. Asterisk, perhaps the most crucial, and certainly the most relentless, aspect of woad cultivation was weeding. Woad plants, despite their eventual hardiness, were surprisingly vulnerable in their early stages. They were not strong competitors against aggressive weeds, which could quickly choke out the young woad. Seedlings stealing precious nutrients, light, and water. Therefore, continuous, back-breaking weeding was an absolute necessity. From the moment the tiny woad seedlings emerged, often just a few weeks after sowing, until the first harvest, and then repeatedly between subsequent harvests, field laborers, both men and women, would spend countless hours bent over, their backs aching under the sun, meticulously pulling weeds by hand. Simple hand tools like small hoes or weeding hooks might assist, but much of the work was done with bare hands, carefully distinguishing the nascent woad leaves from the encroaching weeds. The air would be filled with the subtle scent of crushed weeds and the dry, dusty smell of the soil clinging to calloused hands. The only sounds would be the soft rustle of disturbed foliage, the gentle scrape of tools against the earth, and perhaps the quiet, murmured conversations of the laborers, sharing their weariness and their small hopes. This was not a task for the impatient. It demanded immense physical endurance, keen eyesight, and an almost meditative focus on the immediate patch of earth. Whole communities, often including children, would participate in this vital labor, their lives inextricably linked to the demanding cycle of the woad fields. The success of the harvest, and thus the prosperity of the woad economy, literally lay in the clean rows of these fields. The woad plant also had a particular need for consistent moisture. While it could tolerate some drier periods due to its deep taproot, prolonged droughts would severely reduce the yield and quality of the leaves. Conversely, waterlogging, where fields became saturated and roots drowned, was equally detrimental. Farmers were thus perpetually at the mercy of the weather, their livelihoods hanging on the whims of rainfall. Days of relentless sun would bring anxiety, prompting prayers for gentle rain. Heavy downpours, while replenishing, could also flatten young plants or wash away precious topsoil. There were no sophisticated irrigation systems for large-scale woad cultivation in medieval Europe. Reliance was almost entirely on natural precipitation. This constant anxiety about the elements added another layer of quiet tension to the seemingly peaceful fields. The sound of distant thunder, the gentle patter of raindrops on leaves, or the dry crackle of sun-baked soil were all integral to the woad grower's soundscape. After weeks of patient waiting and relentless weeding, the moment of harvest would finally arrive. This was an intensely busy period, often beginning in late spring and extending into early autumn for the first-year plants. Unlike many crops, woad was not a single grand harvest. Instead, the first-year plants allowed for multiple cuts or pickings, typically ranging from 3 to 5 harvests over the growing season. The first cut usually occurred when the rosette leaves were fully mature and had developed a rich, dark grayish-green color, indicating peak indigo content. Subsequent cuts would follow as new leaves grew back and matured. This extended harvest period meant that the labor in the woad fields was continuous and demanding for many months of the year, providing sustained employment for the agricultural workforce. The method of harvesting was crucial and highly specific, meticulous handpicking of individual leaves. Unlike grains that could be scythed or vegetables that could be pulled, woad leaves had to be detached one by one from the central crown of the plant. This was done to ensure that only mature leaves, rich in dye precursor, were collected, and more importantly, to avoid damaging the plant's crown, allowing it to regenerate and produce subsequent flushes of leaves for later harvests. This meant endless hours of laborers, their backs bent almost double, their fingers deftly plucking the succulent leaves from the stalks. The motion was repetitive, almost trance-like, a silent meditation on the small act of plucking. Imagine the sight: rows upon rows of workers moving slowly, systematically, across the vast fields, their movements synchronized by the task, their faces often shaded by wide-brimmed hats or simple cloths against the sun. The only sounds would be the gentle snapping of leaves as they were detached and the rustle of them falling into the collecting baskets. This was a labor that demanded not only physical stamina, but also an immense degree of patience and attention to detail. Haste could damage the plant, reducing future yields. The sheer volume of leaves required to produce a usable amount of dye was staggering, reinforcing the scale of this painstaking work. The picked leaves were then gathered into simple baskets or large sacks. Sometimes crude hand knives might be used to assist in the plucking, but the emphasis remained on careful, individual selection. As the baskets filled, they would be carried to the edges of the field and quickly loaded onto wagons or carts, typically pulled by patient oxen or sturdy horses. The transport to the processing mill, often nearby, was immediate and urgent. The importance of speed cannot be overstated. Once picked, the woad leaves began a process of enzymatic degradation. The sooner they reached the mill for processing, the higher the yield and quality of the dye. The wagons, sometimes piled high with mountains of freshly picked, grayish-green leaves, would creak and groan their way to the mill. The faint, distinct, earthy, and now slightly pungent smell of bruised woad leaves trailing in their wake, an aroma that was the first true olfactory signal of the blue yet to come. The labor force involved in woad cultivation was substantial and integral to the medieval agricultural economy. It comprised large numbers of agricultural laborers, often Seasonal workers, drawn from the local villages and hamlets surrounding the woad fields. Men performed the heavier tasks of plowing and transporting, while women and children were frequently employed for the meticulous, lighter, though no less demanding work of weeding and hand-picking the leaves. This labor was often poorly paid, but it provided crucial income for peasant families. Their lives were inextricably linked to the cyclical nature of the woad plant. The hope of sowing, the relentless toil of weeding, the focused concentration of harvesting, and the anxious waiting for the dye to be processed. They were the silent, anonymous hands that laid the foundation for Europe's blue obsession, their bodies aching from repetitive motions, their skin tanned by the sun, and their clothes subtly impregnated with the unique scent of the woad fields. The community aspect of this labor, with entire families or village groups working side by side, sharing the burden and the quiet companionship, formed a vital part of the social fabric of medieval agricultural life. Thus, the woad field in medieval Europe was a place of quiet, persistent labor, a testament to humanity's enduring connection to the earth and its patient extraction of natural resources. It was a sensory tapestry woven from the scent of damp soil and bruised leaves, the rustle of wind through the plants, the lowing of oxen, and the silent, rhythmic movements of countless hands. Every furrow plowed, every weed pulled, every leaf plucked was a deliberate act, accumulating slowly but surely towards the profound transformation that awaited in the woad mill, the unveiling of the brilliant blue that lay hidden within the unassuming green. This was the patient foundation upon which the medieval world built its blues, a quiet agricultural masterpiece of endurance and meticulous cultivation. The cyclical demands of the plant dictated the rhythm of human life, forging an unspoken pact between man, earth, and the pursuit of color. Section 2. The woad mill and the fermentation, the birth of the blue ball, the journey of the woad plant, from a vibrant, grayish-green leaf in the sun-drenched field to the inert, dark ball holding its precious blue, culminated at the woad mill. These mills, often robust, utilitarian structures built of local stone and heavy timber, were typically situated conveniently close to the woad fields, minimizing the travel time for the freshly harvested leaves. Their architecture was dictated by function: sturdy walls to support heavy machinery, high roofs to accommodate the bulk of the raw material, and often, critically, abundant ventilation, large, unglazed openings or shuttered windows, hinting at the profound necessity of allowing the powerful aromas to escape, or at least dissipate somewhat, into the surrounding air. The sounds of a woad mill were a continuous, low-frequency hum, the creaking of wagon wheels, the distant calls of laborers, and most distinctively, the rhythmic crunch and squelch of crushing machinery. But before any of these sounds or sights fully registered, one would be struck by the overwhelming, unmistakable, and profoundly pervasive smell that emanated from the woad mill. This was not the subtle, earthy scent of the fields. This was the full, potent, complex aroma of woad in active transformation. It was a singular, unforgettable bouquet, a dominant, sharp, almost cloying note of ammonia, mingling with the deeper, more earthy undertones of decaying vegetable matter, reminiscent of compost, damp hay, and a faint, yet insistent, fecal quality. It was a smell that clung to the air, permeated clothing, and seemed to settle deep into the very fabric of the surrounding landscape. It was a smell that workers carried with them, an indelible mark of their trade, often causing outsiders to recoil. For those within the mill, it was simply the air they breathed, a constant, pungent companion, a testament to the powerful bacterial alchemy underway. This odor, far from being a mere byproduct, was an inherent, unavoidable, and indeed necessary part of the process, a tangible indicator that the hidden blue was being wrestled from its green confinement. Every breath taken within the mill carried this heavy, almost palpable essence, a constant reminder of the raw, organic power being harnessed. Upon arrival, The wagons laden with freshly harvested woad leaves would be immediately unloaded. Time was of the essence. The leaves, once picked, began to degrade, and rapid processing was key to maximizing dye yield. The green leaves, still slightly cool from the field, were typically transported directly to the crushing area within the mill. This was where the first truly transformative step took place. The crushing mechanism often consisted of a set of massive, heavy, conical or cylindrical stone wheels, reminiscent of those found in olive oil or cider presses. These immense millstones, sometimes weighing several tons, were typically set on a sturdy, circular stone base or trough. They were driven by immense power, often provided by a patient ox or horse tethered to a long beam, walking in slow, tireless circles, or, in more advanced mills, by the rhythmic, powerful turn of a water wheel. The deep, resonant groan and rumble of these turning stones, combined with the clink of chains and the soft thud of animal hooves, formed the powerful, mechanical overture to the dye-making process. The fresh woad leaves were continuously fed into the path of these crushing stones. This was a task requiring constant vigilance and sustained physical effort. Laborers, often with pitchforks or simple shovels, would continually push the rustling piles of leaves into the turning trough. As the immense stones rolled over them, the leaves would emit a distinctive crunch and squelch, their cellular structures being relentlessly broken down. Visually, the transformation was immediate. The vibrant grayish-green leaves would quickly be reduced to a coarse, dark, and intensely wet paste. This paste would often have a slightly greasy feel, and its color would darken from the initial green to a murky, almost blackish green. With each crushing revolution, more of the plant's internal fluids were released, intensifying the characteristic woad aroma as the precursors to the blue dye began their journey towards revelation. The air around the crushing area would be particularly heavy with this potent scent, a rich, earthy, and distinctly pungent exhalation from the macerated plant matter. The continuous movement of the millstones, the constant feeding of leaves, and the relentless squelching sound created a hypnotic, almost mesmerizing rhythm, a testament to the tireless conversion of raw plant material into a homogeneous pulp. Once crushed, the woad paste was then carefully gathered and transported to the designated piling areas, often referred to as couches. These were typically large, open, shallow pits or robust, raised wooden or stone platforms within the mill building, or sometimes in semi-enclosed sheds designed for optimal ventilation. The freshly crushed, still warm, and intensely aromatic paste was systematically formed into large, conical piles, meticulously shaped to allow for even fermentation. These woad couches or loaves could be quite substantial in size, resembling enormous dark green haystacks but with a far more potent and distinct smell. The consistent texture of the paste, still moist and sticky, allowed it to be molded into these specific shapes. That it was within these meticulously formed piles that the magic, or rather, the complex biochemistry of initial fermentation truly began. This was the first crucial stage of decomposition, a pivotal moment in the unlocking of the blue pigment. At its core, the process involved the action of naturally occurring enzymes, primarily emulsin, present within the woad leaves. These enzymes, upon the crushing of the plant cells, would come into contact with a colorless chemical precursor known as indican. Through a series of complex reactions, the emulsin would break down the indican, releasing another colorless compound, called indoxyl. The goal, however, was not yet the blue pigment itself, but the creation of an environment where indoxyl could later be transformed. Crucially, as soon as indoxyl was released, it had an immediate tendency to oxidize upon exposure to air, forming insoluble blue indigotin, the very blue pigment we seek. However, for efficient extraction, this initial oxidation needed to be controlled and, paradoxically, prevented at this stage. As the crushed woad paste was piled, The naturally occurring microorganisms within the plant material, combined with the warmth and moisture, would rapidly begin to proliferate. This microbial activity generated significant internal heat. One could often see a subtle hissing or a gentle steaming rising from the woad couches as they warmed, a visible sign of the biochemical reactions vigorously underway. The internal temperature of these piles could rise considerably, sometimes reaching over 50 degrees Celsius, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, accelerating the enzymatic breakdown of indican. It was during this phase that the mill's already potent smell would intensify dramatically. The distinct ammonia-like, decaying vegetable aroma would become even more profound, almost overwhelming in its concentration. It clung to every surface, penetrated the thickest clothing, and made sustained work within the immediate vicinity a challenge for all but the most accustomed. This intense, permeating odor was, in fact, a crucial indicator for the experienced woadmaster. It was the smell of the indigo precursor being liberated, the very essence of blue being born from green decay. This initial fermentation stage was relatively short, typically lasting only 24 to 48 hours. During this critical period, the woadmaster and their skilled laborers would constantly monitor the piles, occasionally turning them with wooden tools to ensure even fermentation and to manage the heat, preventing the pile from becoming too hot, which could damage the enzymes and reduce dye yield. The rhythmic scrape of tools against the fermenting mass and the constant inhalation of the powerful, heady scent were the defining characteristics of this phase. Following this initial fermentation, the still moist, intensely aromatic paste would be ready for the next crucial step, balling. The texture of the fermented paste was now somewhat firmer than the initial crush, darker in color, often a deep brownish black, and even more concentrated in its unique aroma. This task, repetitive and often performed by large groups of laborers, frequently women and children, was the physical manifestation of patience and consistency. The workers would sit or stand at long tables or benches, each with a portion of the prepared woad paste before them. With bare hands or sometimes with the aid of simple molds, they would scoop up small, manageable portions of the paste and, with a highly practiced, rhythmic motion, roll them into firm, dense, apple-sized woad balls. The paste would be sticky, cool, and somewhat greasy to the touch, its pungent odor now clinging directly to the hands. The repetitive squelch and thump as each ball was formed and gently placed aside would create a low, continuous chorus in the balling area. The goal was to create perfectly uniform balls. Consistency in size and density was crucial for the subsequent drying and processing stages. The sheer number of these balls produced daily was immense, reflecting the vast quantities of leaves harvested and crushed. Each ball, dark green to brownish black in color, often with a slightly shiny surface, was a compact package of potential blue. Once formed, these woad balls required extensive drying. This was a slow and deliberate process, essential for stabilizing the dye precursor and preparing the balls for long-term storage and subsequent, more intense fermentation. The freshly formed, moist, and aromatic woad balls were carefully transported to specially constructed drying racks. These were elaborate, multi-tiered wooden frames, often resembling enormous scaffolding, typically erected outdoors in dedicated drying yards, or within large, well-ventilated sheds that offered protection from the elements while allowing maximum air circulation. The balls were meticulously laid out on these racks, often in single layers or with specific spacing, to ensure even exposure to air from all sides. The visual spectacle of thousands upon thousands of these dark earthy balls, neatly arranged on racks stretching as far as the eye could see, was a striking image of organized production. The drying process itself was a study in patience. It was not a matter of hours, but of several weeks, or even months, depending on the climate and the size of the balls. During this period, The balls would gradually harden, shrink slightly in size, and lighten subtly in color, shifting from a very dark brownish black to a lighter, more muted brown. The pervasive aroma, while still distinct, would lessen in its sharpness as moisture evaporated, becoming earthier and more concentrated. Constant vigilance was required to protect the drying balls from unexpected rain, which could remoisten them and reactivate unwanted fermentation, or from excessive, scorching sun, which could prematurely degrade the dye precursor. This slow, steady transformation, driven by the imperceptible forces of evaporation and oxidation, prepared the woad balls for their next critical stage. The soft clink of the hardening balls as they were occasionally turned or moved was a quiet testament to their slow metamorphosis. The dried woad balls, now hard and relatively stable, contain the latent blue. To truly unlock this pigment and make it ready for the dyer's vat, they had to undergo a second, far more intense and notoriously malodorous fermentation, often referred to as the coupe or woad vat process. This was the true heart of medieval woad processing, a complex biochemical reduction that required immense skill, precise temperature control, and a high tolerance for truly offensive odors. That this transformation took place in massive, deep coupe vats or pits, often constructed of stone, sometimes brick-lined, and sunk partly into the ground to aid in temperature stability. These vats could be enormous, capable of holding hundreds of gallons of liquid. The dried woad balls were first broken down, sometimes by grinding them again, though this was more common for finer products, or simply by re-wetting and mashing them to create a more pliable paste. This paste was then introduced into the coupe vat and mixed thoroughly with water, but water alone was not enough. To initiate this specific type of anaerobic, alkaline fermentation required, other crucial substances were added. Perhaps the most famous, and certainly the most pungent, was urine. Often, large quantities of human urine, diligently collected for this purpose, would be added. Urine, rich in urea, would break down into ammonia, providing the necessary alkalinity. Other alkaline agents, such as lime calcium hydroxide or wood ash, might also be incorporated to carefully control the pH of the mixture. The addition of these materials, particularly the urine, would immediately intensify the putrid ammoniacal smell to an almost unbearable degree, filling the entire mill, and indeed the surrounding village, with its suffocating potency. The conditions within the coupe vat had to be meticulously controlled. The mixture was kept warm, often by means of controlled fires built beneath or around the vat, or by the sheer internal heat generated by the intense microbial activity. The temperature was constantly monitored by the woad master, who possessed an intuitive, experienced sense for the optimal range. Too cold, and the bacteria would not thrive. Too hot, and the delicate chemical balance could be destroyed, ruining the batch. This warmth was crucial because specific anaerobic bacteria, introduced naturally from the woad paste itself, were the true alchemists of the coupe. These bacteria, in the absence of oxygen and in the presence of alkalinity, would act upon the still colorless indigotin, the raw, insoluble blue pigment that had formed during initial oxidation in the first fermentation or during drying. Reduce it back into a soluble colorless form known as leucoindigotin, often referred to as woad white. This was the magical transformation. The insoluble blue pigment was chemically converted into a soluble, transparent liquid that could then penetrate textile fibers. Visually, the surface of the liquid in the vat would develop a distinctive shimmering, iridescent film, a phenomenon known as the copper flower, a telltale sign that the reduction process was successfully underway. Subtle bubbles might also rise to the surface, indicating the microbial activity within. The woad master and their laborers would constantly stir and agitate the mixture with long wooden poles, ensuring even fermentation and preventing the paste from settling too densely. This stirring also helped to manage the temperature and distribute the bacteria evenly. The smell during this stage was at its absolute peak, a truly putrid, intensely ammoniacal, decaying aroma that was unique to the woad mill. It was the scent of concentrated power of a chemical reaction bubbling forth. It clung to the hair, the skin, the clothes, and the very memory of anyone who encountered it. This critical stage of fermentation in the coop could last for several days, requiring round-the-clock monitoring and precise adjustments. The woad master's deep experience was paramount in judging the exact moment when the leuco-indicatin was fully developed and stable, ready for the next step. Once the woad master determined that the fermentation in the coop vat was complete and the precious leuco-indicatin was fully formed and stable in its soluble, colorless state, the final steps to extract the blue pigment could begin. The liquid, now a murky yellowish green but holding the invisible blue, would be carefully drained or separated from the remaining solid woad sludge. This liquid was then transferred to another shallow vat or a series of settling tanks. This was the moment of revelation, the transformation from hidden potential to visible color. The colorless liquid containing the leuco-indicatin was deliberately exposed to air. As oxygen came into contact with the leuco-indicatin, a rapid oxidation reaction would occur. Before one's very eyes, the liquid would slowly, miraculously, begin to change color. It would first acquire a yellowish tinge, then slowly shift to green, then a deep, purplish blue, and finally a rich, vibrant, insoluble indicatin, the pure blue pigment, would precipitate out of the solution as tiny shimmering particles. This magical moment of color appearing as if from nowhere, out of a seemingly colorless liquid, was a powerful testament to the hidden chemistry of the woad plant, the true goal of months of patient labor. The newly formed blue pigment, now in suspension as fine particles, would slowly settle to the bottom of the vat. The clear liquid above it would then be carefully drained away. What remained was a thick blue mud-like sludge. This blue sludge was then meticulously collected, often scraped from the bottom of the vats with simple tools. To further refine the pigment and remove impurities, this blue sludge would often undergo a process of washing and pressing. It might be washed repeatedly with clean water and then pressed in strong cloth bags under heavy weights or in screw presses to remove as much excess water as possible. The water squeezed out would be a murky, faintly blue liquid, while the compressed residue was the concentrated indigo, the final product from the woad mill was typically formed into small, solid cakes or granules. This compressed blue pigment, still slightly damp but now much firmer, was carefully shaped into small cakes, often circular or rectangular, or broken into granules. These solid forms made the woad dye easier to transport, store, and measure for the dyers who would eventually purchase it. The texture of these finished dye cakes would be dense, earthy, and slightly gritty to the touch, and their color a deep, rich blue, often so dark it appeared almost black until viewed in light. While significantly reduced from the overwhelming pungency of the fermentation vats, the finished woad dye still retained a subtle, earthy, and distinctly ammoniacal aroma, a quiet echo of the rigorous malodorous process from which it emerged. This concentrated blue essence was the culmination of the patient cultivation, the rhythmic crushing, and the intense, controlled putrefaction, a triumph of medieval ingenuity over the stubborn secrets of a humble green plant. The finished woad ball, in its dark, unassuming solidity, held within it the quiet power to transform plain cloth into the magnificent blues that adorned medieval royalty, peasants, and religious figures alike, a silent testament to the enduring human desire for color extracted from the very earth. Section 3. The dyer's vat, society's blue, and the lingering legacy having traversed the fields and endured the unique aromas of the woad mill. Our patient journey now leads us to the heart of another specialized medieval craft, the dyer's workshop. This was the place where the dried, hard woad cakes or granules, produced with such laborious care at the mill, finally arrived. The atmosphere here was subtly different from the mill. While still a place of industry and strong odors, it often possessed a warmth and a certain bustling quietude, punctuated by the sounds of sloshing liquids, the rustle of fabric, and the gentle crackle of heating fires. The lingering, earthy, ammoniacal scent of woad, though perhaps less overwhelmingly pungent than at the mill, was an undeniable and permanent fixture, a constant olfactory reminder of the precious commodity being handled. Bundles of woad cakes, dark and seemingly inert, would sit awaiting their final glorious transformation. The central feature of any woad dyer's workshop was, without question, the dye vat itself, often affectionately, or perhaps resignedly, known as the blue vat. These vats were substantial, robust constructions, designed to withstand both heat and the corrosive nature of the chemical reactions taking place within. Typically, they were large, deep receptacles, often crafted from heavy timber staves bound with iron hoops, or sometimes meticulously lined with stone or brick, ensuring their durability. Many were partially sunk into the earthen floor of the workshop, providing a degree of natural insulation and stability. Their sheer size conveyed their importance, holding hundreds, sometimes thousands, of gallons of liquid dye. The preparation of this vat was a skill passed down through generations, often guarded jealously as a trade secret. It was a complex, living, chemical system, not a simple mix and stir process. The dyer would begin by carefully introducing water into the vat, often warmed to a specific temperature. Then, the precious woad dye cakes would be added. But woad, in its finished form from the mill, was the insoluble blue pigment, indigotin. To make it dye fabric, it first needed to be rendered soluble and colorless once more. This required creating a highly specific, anaerobic, oxygen-free, and alkaline-reducing environment. To achieve this, the dyer would introduce a careful selection of reducing agents or fermenting assistants. This was where some of the more infamous ingredients came into play. Often, large quantities of old urine were added, specifically aged, stagnant urine, whose urea had naturally broken down into ammonia, providing crucial alkalinity and nitrogen for the necessary bacteria. Other organic materials like stale beer, bran, providing carbohydrates for bacterial growth, madder, a root dye, but here used for its fermenting properties, or even various fermenting fruit or vegetable scraps might be included. Each of these ingredients contributed to fostering the specific types of anaerobic bacteria required to unlock the blue. The smell of the active dye vat was a legend unto itself, distinct from the mill's aroma but equally potent and pervasive. It was a complex symphony of warmth, decay, and transformation. The dominant note was still that sharp, penetrating ammonia, amplified by the heat. This mingled with the earthy, often slightly yeasty scent of fermentation, reminiscent of a very strong, somewhat sour beer. There might be subtle undertones of the original woad, combined with the specific putridity of decaying organic matter, perhaps even a hint of something sweetish, almost sickly, rising from the depths. This composite aroma filled the entire dyer's workshop, clinging to the wooden beams, the tools, and the very clothes of the dyers. It was an inescapable presence, the true olfactory signature of the medieval dyer, and like the mill, it was the smell of prosperity, even if it could turn the stomach of the uninitiated. Crucially, the woad vat had to be maintained at a specific warm temperature, typically between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, approximately 104 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. This warmth was vital for promoting the growth and activity of the necessary anaerobic bacteria. Often, controlled fires would be kept burning beneath or around the vat, or heated water would be circulated, requiring constant monitoring by the dyer. Too hot, and the bacteria would be killed. Too cold, and the fermentation would slow or cease. The dyer, without thermometers, relied on their intuitive sense, touching the vase surface, observing the subtle effervescence, and of course, noting the strength and character of the smell. This carefully maintained warmth and alkalinity fostered the intricate fermentation and reduction process within the vat. The anaerobic bacteria, thriving in this oxygen-deprived environment, performed the chemical marvel. They would reduce the insoluble blue indigotin from the woad cakes back into its soluble, colorless form, leucoindigotin, or as dyers called it, dye white. This was the profound chemical transformation. The stubbornly insoluble blue pigment became a transparent liquid that could now permeate and bind to textile fibers. The dyer would patiently wait for the vat to strike or set, recognizing the precise moment when the reduction was complete. A healthy, well-reduced vat would display distinct visual signs. On its surface, a shimmering, iridescent film, often with hues of copper, purple, and blue, would form the famous flower or copper flower, a beautiful and clear indicator of successful reduction. The liquid beneath this flower would be clear, often a yellowish-green or brownish hue, completely devoid of blue color. A bubbling or frothing surface might indicate over-fermentation or unwanted air entry, which could ruin the vat. The dyer would regularly and gently stir the mixture with long wooden poles, ensuring even fermentation, checking for signs of unwanted oxidation, and carefully managing the temperature. The soft slosh of the liquid, the almost imperceptible hiss of gases, and the continuous monitoring of the flower were the quiet rhythms of the vat. With the dye vat prepared and perfectly struck, the momentous dyeing process could finally begin, the moment when the colorless solution would impart its latent blue. The textiles to be dyed, whether bundles of yarn, lengths of woven fabric, typically wool or linen, sometimes silk, or individual garments, had to be meticulously prepared beforehand. This involved thorough scouring or cleaning to remove any natural oils, greases, or impurities that might impede dye absorption. The fabrics would be repeatedly washed, often in lye or soap, until they were perfectly clean and absorbent. They were then thoroughly wetted, ensuring the fibers were fully hydrated and ready to accept the dye. The texture of these prepared textiles would be clean, slightly stiff when dry, but soft and pliable when wet, ready for their transformation. The actual immersion of the textiles into the vat was a crucial, careful step. The dyer, or their assistants, would slowly and gently lower the fabric or yarn into the warm, murky, yellowish-green liquid of the vat. There was no immediate color change. The fabric, as it sank into the depths, would simply become saturated with the colorless leucoindigotin. This quiet lack of instant gratification, the waiting for the magic to occur, was part of the patient ritual. The fabric would remain steeped in the vat for a specific period, the steeping time ranging from a few minutes for lighter shades to several hours, or even multiple immersions over days for deeper, more intense blues. The dyer's skill lay in judging the precise duration required to achieve the desired shade, pulling out small samples to check progress. The soft plop as the fabric entered the liquid, the subtle swish as it was manipulated, and the gentle drip as a sample was lifted for inspection, were the only sounds in this patient waiting game. Then came the true marvel, the magic of oxidation, or airing. This was the visual spectacle, the dramatic transformation that made all the previous laborious steps worthwhile. Once the dyer deemed the fabric sufficiently steeped, it was carefully and slowly lifted from the vat. As the dripping fabric emerged from the depths of the oxygen-deprived liquid and came into contact with the air, the true wonder began. Before one's very eyes, the fabric, initially a drab, muddy greenish-yellow, would slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first begin to change. A pale blue tinge would appear, gradually deepening through shades of green, then vibrant sky blue, then sapphire, finally settling into a rich, deep, resonant blue. This breathtaking color change, known as bluesing, was the visual climax of the entire woad process, a testament to the power of a simple chemical reaction with atmospheric oxygen. The fresh, damp smell of the fabric, now subtly infused with the woad aroma, mingled with the clean scent of the air as the invisible became vividly apparent. This process of airing could be repeated multiple times, with re-immersion in the vat, to build up layers of dye and achieve even darker, richer blues. After the desired shade was achieved through repeated immersions and airings, the dyed fabric would undergo thorough rinsing. It would be repeatedly washed in large tubs or flowing water, often rivers or streams if available, to remove any excess dye particles, unreacted chemicals, or impurities. The rinse water would initially be a murky blue, gradually clearing with each wash, a visible indication of the removal of loose pigment. Finally, the deeply blue fabric would be hung to dry, often stretched on lines or frames outdoors, allowing the remaining moisture to evaporate and the color to fully set. The sight of vast quantities of fabric drying in vibrant shades of blue under the sun would have been a common and striking feature of medieval dyeing towns, a beautiful contrast to the earthy green of the woad fields and the murky depths of the vats. The final feel of the dry dyed cloth would be soft yet durable, now imbued with a color that spoke of patience, skill, and hidden magic. The patient cultivation and processing of woad had a profound and multifaceted societal impact and economic significance throughout medieval Europe, shaping its economy, its communities, and its very visual identity. The woad trade was an industry of immense scale. Woad was not just a local commodity. It was a major article of international commerce. Woad-producing regions in France, Germany, and England became powerful economic hubs, controlling vast networks of trade. Woad merchants, often known as pasteliers, amassed considerable wealth, their influence reaching far beyond their immediate towns. The trade routes for woad crisscrossed Europe, relying on river barges, overland wagons, and coastal shipping, all contributing to a complex economic web. The price of woad was subject to market fluctuations, wars, and weather patterns, but it remained consistently valuable due to the high demand for its unique blue. Its economic importance was such that governments often imposed strict regulations on its production and sale, and protected its trade routes. The sheer volume of this trade, the endless flow of woad balls from rural mills to urban dyeing centers, underscored its significance. The processing and application of woad fostered the development of highly specialized craft guilds. The dyers, in particular, formed powerful and influential guilds, meticulously controlling entry into the profession through long apprenticeships, often 7 years or more, rigorous examinations, and the strict guarding of trade secrets. Each dyer's workshop possessed subtle variations in their vat recipes and techniques, passed down through generations. These guilds provided mutual support, regulated quality, and defended their economic interests, sometimes fiercely, against competition or new innovations. The sounds of their workshops, the sloshing of vats, the rhythmic pounding of fabric, the hushed conversations of masters instructing apprentices, were integral to the urban soundscape. The resulting blue textiles held a powerful social status. Blue, especially a rich, deep blue obtained from woad, was not a cheap color. Its labor-intensive production and the expense of the woad dye itself meant that a truly vibrant blue garment often signified wealth, status, and prestige. It was a color frequently associated with royalty, nobility, and the highest ranks of society, symbolizing authority, loyalty, and dignity. In religious iconography, blue was often the color of the Virgin Mary, symbolizing purity, truth, and heavenly grace, making woad an indispensable dye for ecclesiastical vestments and religious art. The ability to wear such a deep blue was a visual statement of one's standing in the medieval social hierarchy, beyond the elite. Woad blue deeply infused daily life across various social strata. While the deepest blues were expensive, lighter shades were more accessible. Woad dyed countless garments: woolen tunics, stockings, cloaks, and hoods worn by peasants and townsfolk alike. It adorned banners, flags, and heraldry, signifying allegiance and identity. It colored the rough fabrics of peasant smocks and the finer weaves of merchants' doublets. The ubiquitous presence of blue, in its various shades, was a constant visual element in the medieval landscape, from the markets to the battlefields, from the humble cottage to the lord's manor. It was a backdrop, a splash of color, a quiet testament to the patient labors that created it. Compared to other available dyes, woad blue stood out for its permanence and richness. While other plant-based dyes existed, reds from madder, yellows from weld or saffron, many were prone to fading or lacked the depth of woad. Woad dye, when properly applied through the vatting process, produced a remarkably light-fast and wash-fast blue that held its color for years, making it highly valued for durable textiles. This technical superiority contributed significantly to its economic dominance. And throughout all this, from field to finished fabric, the pervasive smell of woad and the dye vat would have been an undeniable part of the sensory landscape of medieval Europe. In woad-producing regions, the air itself would carry the telltale aroma, a constant low-level background scent. In towns with active dye houses, the specific, pungent aroma of the blue vat would have been a defining characteristic, often leading residents to hold their noses when passing a dyer's street. It was the smell of industry, of prosperity, of a specialized trade. For those who worked with woad, it was simply the smell of their livelihood, a familiar part of their existence, even if unpleasant to others. It was the smell of blue being born. The reign of woad, however, was not eternal. Its decline began with the arrival of indigo from distant lands, particularly from India and later the Americas. Indigo, derived from a different plant, Indigofera tinctoria, offered a far more concentrated source of the same indigotin pigment. It was cheaper to produce in bulk and easier to transport, as less raw plant material was needed to yield the same amount of dye. Starting in the late medieval period and accelerating significantly in the early modern era, 16th–18th centuries, indigo began to inexorably displace woad. This led to considerable economic struggles for the traditional woad-producing regions, and vigorous political and economic resistance from woad barons and dyers' guilds, who saw their livelihoods threatened. Governments, at first, often banned or heavily taxed indigo imports to protect the native woad industry, but the superior economics of indigo eventually prevailed. The demise of woad as the primary source of blue was a slow process, but an inevitable one. While it eventually faded from widespread commercial dominance, woad continued to be used in niche applications, particularly as a bottom or base layer for other colors, or in regions where indigo remained difficult to access. Yet, despite its eventual decline, the enduring legacy of woad is woven deeply into the fabric of European history and culture. Its memory lives on in countless place names: woad green in England, pastel in France, and numerous Färber, dyer, or Blau, blue-related names across Germany. The very concept of blue as a color of power, purity, and depth in Western culture owes much to the centuries when woad was its primary source. It contributed to the visual heritage of medieval art, clothing, and symbolism. The story of woad, in its very mundaneness, offers a profound lesson. This entire complex, smelly, laborious process, rooted in a humble plant and refined through basic yet intricate medieval chemistry, provided a fundamental visual element of medieval life. It spurred significant economic and social development, connecting distant fields to bustling urban workshops and shaping trade routes across the continent. The cumulative effect of repetitive, painstaking labor, from the bent backs in the fields to the patient stirring of the vats, slowly but surely built a foundation for the vibrant material culture of the age. It is a testament to the art of patience. Every step, from the germination of a seed to the delicate flower on the dye vat, required an immense degree of waiting, careful observation, and unwavering dedication. It is a story of slow, deliberate creation, where nature's secrets were coaxed forth through persistent human effort. Finally, the unique sensory memory of woad, particularly its persistent and distinct aroma, serves as a powerful connection to this past. Even the unpleasant smells are an integral part of history's rich, multisensory tapestry, providing a direct, visceral link to the lives and labors of those who toiled to produce this magnificent blue. The echoes of quiet industry, the rhythmic sounds of the mill and the dyer's workshop, and the ever-present, earthy scent of woad linger in the historical imagination, a quiet testament to the humble origins of one of the world's most beloved colors.